The clock on Keisha Williams's dashboard read 7:45 p.m. as she turned onto Maple Street, her daughter's soccer cleats still muddy in the back seat. It had been a long day. First, the early morning conference call about the federal case she was prosecuting, then rushing to make it to her daughter's game on time. Being a single mom and a U.S. attorney wasn't easy, but seeing her daughter score the winning goal made every sacrifice worth it. The radio played softly as she drove through the quiet suburban neighborhood. This wasn't her usual route home, but construction had closed the main highway. She glanced at her speedometer, 32 miles per hour in a 35 zone. She was being extra careful, knowing how some officers in this part of town could be. That's when she saw the red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Keisha's heart sank, but she wasn't worried about a ticket. She had been driving, safely, well within the speed limit. Maybe the officer just wanted to pass her. She pulled over to the right side of the road, put the car in park, and rolled down her window. The cool evening air rushed in as she placed both hands on the steering wheel, just like her father had taught her years ago. Two officers approached her car. The older one, a tall man with graying hair, came to her driver's side window. His partner, younger and stockier, positioned himself near the passenger side. Something about their approach felt different from the traffic stop she had witnessed in her professional life. There was an aggression in their walk, a tension that seemed unnecessary for a simple traffic violation. "License and registration," the older officer said without any greeting. No explanation of why she had been stopped. No good evening or, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Just a cold demand. Keisha kept her voice calm and polite. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why?" "You stopped me." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said license and registration now." She reached slowly for her purse, announcing each movement. "I'm reaching for my purse to get my license." Her federal prosecutor instincts kicked in. She was already thinking about how this interaction was going differently than it should. In her 15 years prosecuting cases, she had seen countless police videos. This wasn't following any standard protocol. As she handed over her documents, the younger officer shined his flashlight directly into her face, even though the street was well lit. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "Officer, I'd like to know what I'm being stopped for," Keisha said, her legal training taking over. She knew her rights, but she also knew that exercising them as a black woman during a traffic stop could be dangerous. "I'm not going to ask again," the older officer said, his hand moving closer to his service weapon. Out of the car, Keisha's mind raced. In courtrooms, she commanded respect. Judges listened when she spoke. Other attorneys sought her advice. But here, on this quiet street, she was just another black woman being treated like a criminal for no reason. She stepped out of her car, her heart pounding. "Officer, I was driving the speed limit. I haven't done anything wrong." "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle," the younger officer commanded. This was escalating far beyond anything a routine traffic stop should involve. Keisha had prosecuted officers for excessive force. She knew what reasonable police conduct looked like, and this wasn't it. "Sir, I don't understand why this is necessary," she said, but complied with the order. The concrete was cold under her palms as she placed her hands on her car. The older officer began searching her purse without asking permission. "What's this?" he asked, pulling out her work phone, a government-issued device that she kept separate from her personal phone. "It's my work phone," she answered honestly. "What kind of work?" the younger officer asked while patting her down more aggressively than necessary. Keisha paused. She could have ended this entire situation right there. One flash of her federal credentials and these officers would have changed their tune completely. But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity about how far this would go. Maybe it was the prosecutor in her wanting to see the full extent of their misconduct. Or maybe it was the realization that this was happening to her, despite her position, despite her education, despite everything she had achieved. "I work in law," she said simply. The officers exchanged a look that seemed to say, "Sure you do." They searched her entire car, pulling out her daughter's soccer equipment, her briefcase, even the reusable shopping bags in her trunk. Nothing they did was justified by the supposed traffic violation. They were on a fishing expedition, looking for any reason to arrest her. After 20 minutes of searching and finding nothing, the older officer seemed frustrated. That's when things took a turn for the worse. "Ma'am, you were being argumentative and uncooperative," he said, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct." Keisha's legal mind immediately caught the absurdity. "Officer, how can I be arrested for resisting arrest when I wasn't under arrest for anything else?" "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, grabbing her wrist roughly. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Keisha made a decision that would change everything. She would not reveal who she was. Not yet. She wanted to see how deep this rabbit hole went. She wanted to experience what countless other innocent people experienced every day in the American justice system. At the police station, she was processed like any other arrestee. Fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. When the booking officer asked her occupation, she simply repeated, "I work in law." "Public defender?" the officer asked with a smirk. "Something like that," Keisha replied, as she sat in that cell, listening to the other women who had been arrested that night, mostly for minor offenses, mostly Black and Hispanic women who couldn't afford good lawyers. Keisha realized she was about to get an education that no law school could provide. She had spent years prosecuting criminals and defending the system. Now she was about to see it from the other side. And what she discovered would change not just her own life, but the entire local justice system. The arresting officers filled out their report that night, confident that this was just another routine arrest of someone who would plea bargain and disappear into the system. They had no idea they had just arrested one of the most powerful federal prosecutors in the state. They had no idea that their routine abuse of power was about to meet someone who had the knowledge, the authority, and now the personal motivation to fight back. But Keisha wasn't ready to reveal her hand yet. She wanted to see how far the corruption went. She wanted to experience what it felt like to be powerless in a system that was supposed to protect everyone equally. She was about to get an education that would fuel her passion for justice for years to come. The bail hearing was scheduled for the next morning. Keisha sat in the cold holding cell listening to the stories of the other women around her. There was Maria, arrested for sleeping in her car after losing her apartment. There was Patricia, picked up for a $20 unpaid parking ticket that had somehow turned into a warrant. Each story was a small tragedy, a life disrupted by a system that seemed designed to crush people who were already struggling. When her turn came, Keisha stood before the judge. Not the same one who would hear her case, but another tired-looking man who barely glanced up from his paperwork. Her bail was set at $5,000 for what should have been, at most, a minor traffic violation. She paid it without complaint and walked out of the courthouse, her mind already working. The first thing she did was call her sister to pick up her daughter from school. She couldn't explain everything over the phone, but she promised to tell her the whole story later. Then she drove to her office, the federal building where she had worked for 15 years, where her nameplate read, Assistant U.S. Attorney, and where people called her counselor with respect. Sitting in her corner, office looking out at the city skyline, Keisha felt like she was living in two different worlds. Here she was powerful. Here she commanded respect. Here she had sent corrupt police officers to federal prison. But last night, she had been just another Black woman being abused by the system. She pulled up the police report on her computer. Reading it was like reading fiction. According to Officers Thompson and Rodriguez, she had been belligerent and uncooperative. They claimed she had made threatening gestures and refused to comply with lawful orders. They wrote that she had been driving erratically and appeared to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs. None of it was true. Not a single word. Keisha had requested the dashcam footage through official channels, using her position to expedite the process. When it arrived 3 days later, she watched it alone in her office, her anger growing with each passing minute. The video told a completely different story. It showed her driving normally, well within the speed limit. It showed her pulling over immediately when the lights came on. It showed her being polite and cooperative throughout the entire encounter. It showed the officers searching her car without cause, escalating the situation without reason, and ultimately arresting her for crimes that existed only in their imagination. But Keisha made a decision that surprised even herself. She wasn't going to use her position to make this go away quietly. She wasn't going to have her assistant call the prosecutor's office and explain who she was. She wasn't going to let her colleagues handle this while she stepped back. She was going to fight this case like any other citizen would have to fight it. At home that evening, her daughter asked why she seemed so distracted. "Mom, are you okay? You've been quiet all week." Keisha looked at her beautiful, intelligent daughter and felt a surge of determination. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Mommy is just working on something important, something that might help a lot of people." She spent the next 2 weeks preparing her defense the way any person without connections would have to prepare. She couldn't use the federal resources available to her. She couldn't call in favors from judges who knew her reputation. She had to rely on the same public systems that everyone else used. She visited the law library at the local community college, sitting next to students and ordinary citizens who were trying to understand their legal rights. She filed her own motions, standing in line at the clerk's office with everyone else. She made her own copies, paid her own filing fees, and navigated the bureaucracy that she usually bypassed with a phone call. It was eye-opening and frustrating. The system was designed to wear people down, to make them give up and accept plea bargains even when they were innocent. She watched other defendants, most of them poor, most of them minorities, being pressured to plead guilty to things they didn't do just to avoid the uncertainty of trial. The prosecutor assigned to her case was a young man named David Chen, fresh out of law school and eager to make his mark. He offered her a plea bargain: plead guilty to a reduced charge of disturbing the peace, pay a fine, and it would all be over. "Ms. Williams," he said during their meeting, "I understand you work in law. You know how the system works. This is a generous offer. If you take this to trial, you're risking much more serious consequences." Keisha looked at him across the small conference table in the prosecutor's office. She could have ended his career with a phone call. She outranked him by about 10 levels in the legal hierarchy, but he didn't know that, and she wasn't going to tell him. "I appreciate the offer," she said politely, "but I'm not guilty of anything. I want my day in court." Chen shrugged. "Your choice, but I should warn you. Judge Brennan doesn't like it when people waste the court's time. He's going to throw the book at you if you lose." Judge Harold Brennan. Keisha knew that name from the legal community. He was known for being tough on crime, which in practice meant being tough on poor people and minorities. She had heard rumors about his courtroom, whispered complaints from defense attorneys about his bias, but nothing had ever been proven. Now she was going to see it firsthand. During her preparation, Keisha discovered something that made her blood run cold. She pulled the records of other cases that had come before Judge Brennan involving similar charges. The pattern was clear and undeniable. White defendants were more likely to have charges dropped or reduced. Black and Hispanic defendants were more likely to be convicted and receive harsher sentences, even for identical crimes. She found cases where white defendants caught with drugs were sentenced to probation, while black defendants with the same amount received jail time. She found cases where white defendants who actually resisted arrest were given community service, while black defendants who were merely accused of resisting were sent to prison. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also something that no one had ever compiled before. Everyone knew about the bias, but no one had documented it systematically. Keisha realized she was sitting on a powder keg. This wasn't just about her case anymore. This was about a pattern of systemic discrimination that had been going on for years, affecting hundreds of innocent people who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. She made copies of everything, organized it meticulously, and prepared for battle. But she also made another decision. She was going to let this play out. She was going to see how far Judge Brennan would go when he thought he was dealing with just another black woman without connections. She was going to give him enough rope to hang himself. The night before her trial, Keisha sat in her home office, surrounded by legal documents and evidence. Her federal credentials were locked in her desk drawer. Tomorrow, She would walk into that courtroom not as a U.S. attorney, but as an ordinary citizen fighting for justice. She knew it was risky. She knew she might lose. But she also knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to show the world exactly how broken the system really is, and she was about to do exactly that. The courthouse was buzzing with activity when Keisha arrived at 8 in the morning. She had deliberately dressed simply, a plain black pantsuit, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wanted to blend in with the other defendants, most of whom looked nervous and overwhelmed. Judge Harold Brennan's courtroom was on the 3rd floor. As Keisha walked through the metal detectors and past the security guards, she noticed how differently she was being treated compared to her usual visits to federal court. Here, she was just another person in the system, subject to the same searches and suspicious looks as everyone else. The courtroom itself was old and intimidating. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows. About 30 people sat in the gallery, mostly family members of defendants, a few lawyers, and some court watchers. Keisha took a seat in the back, observing everything with the trained eye of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. Judge Brennan entered at exactly 9 o'clock. He was a tall, thin man in his early 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the authority of someone who had been making decisions about people's lives for over a decade, but there was something else in his demeanor, a coldness that made Keisha immediately uncomfortable. The first few cases were quick. A parking violation, dismissed after the defendant showed proof of payment. A noise complaint against a college student, community service, and a fine. Then came the case that made Keisha's stomach turn. A young Hispanic man named Carlos was charged with the same thing she was, resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. His story was almost identical to hers. A traffic stop that escalated for no reason. Officers who claimed he was uncooperative, charges that seemed to come from nowhere. Carlos had a public defender, a tired-looking woman who seemed to be handling about 20 cases that morning. She had clearly spent maybe 5 minutes reviewing his file. "Your Honor," the public defender said, "my client would like to enter a plea of guilty to the reduced charge of disturbing the peace." Judge Brennan barely looked up. "Fine. 60 days in jail, suspended if he completes 40 hours of community service and pays a $500 fine. Next case." Keisha watched Carlos nod gratefully, probably relieved that he wasn't going to jail. But she knew what had really happened. An innocent man had just pleaded guilty to something he didn't do because fighting it was too risky and too expensive. The next case was different. A white college student about the same age as Carlos, charged with public intoxication and resisting arrest. This time there was actual evidence. Body camera footage showing him stumbling around, yelling at officers and pulling away when they tried to arrest him. His lawyer was well-dressed and confident. "Your Honor, my client has no prior record. He made a mistake, but he's learned from it. He's already enrolled in an alcohol counseling program." Judge Brennan smiled slightly. "Young man, we all make mistakes when we're your age. Case dismissed. But I want to see proof that you completed that counseling program." The contrast was stunning. Carlos, who was probably innocent, got community service and a fine. The white student, who was clearly guilty and had actually resisted arrest, walked free. Finally, it was Keisha's turn. "The People versus Keisha Williams," the clerk announced. Keisha stood up and walked to the defendant's table. She could feel Judge Brennan's eyes on her, sizing her up. She had prosecuted hundreds of cases, but being on this side of the courtroom felt completely different. "Ms. Williams," Judge Brennan said, his voice carrying a tone of barely concealed irritation, "I see you've chosen to represent yourself. Are you sure that's wise?" "Yes, Your Honor, I'm comfortable representing myself." The prosecutor, David Chen, called his first witness. Officer Thompson took the stand and was sworn in. He looked confident, like someone who had testified in these situations many times before. "Officer Thompson," Chen began, "please tell the court what happened on the evening in question." Thompson's testimony was a masterpiece of fiction. According to him, Keisha had been driving erratically, weaving between lanes. When he pulled her over, she was immediately hostile and argumentative. She refused to provide her license and registration until he demanded them multiple times. When he asked her to step out of the vehicle, she became belligerent and made threatening gestures. At that point, Thompson said, looking directly at Judge Brennan, I feared for my safety and my partner's safety. The defendant was clearly agitated and potentially dangerous. Keisha listened to this fairy tale with growing amazement. It was like listening to someone describe a completely different event. But what struck her most was how comfortable Thompson seemed lying under oath. This wasn't his first time fabricating a story on the witness stand. When it was her turn to cross-examine, Keisha stood up calmly. Officer Thompson, you mentioned that I was driving erratically. Was this interaction recorded on your vehicle's dashboard camera? Yes, ma'am. And you've reviewed that footage, correct? Yes, ma'am. In your report, you state that I was weaving between lanes. Can you point to the specific time on the video where this weaving occurs? Thompson shifted uncomfortably. Well, it's not always easy to see on camera. Objection, Chen interrupted. The witness has already testified about what he observed. Sustained, Judge Brennan said quickly. Move on, Ms. Williams. Keisha tried a different approach. Officer Thompson, how many times did you have to ask me for my license and registration? Several times. You were being uncooperative. And at what point did I become, as you put it, belligerent and threatening? Right from the beginning, your whole attitude was hostile. Keisha nodded. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce the dashboard camera footage as evidence so the jury can see exactly what happened. Objection, Chen said immediately. The footage is unclear and could be misleading. Judge Brennan didn't even pause to consider it. Sustained. The testimony of the officer is sufficient. Keisha felt a chill run down her spine. In federal court, that footage would have been admitted without question. Here, Judge Brennan was actively preventing evidence that would prove her innocence. Officer Rodriguez's testimony was almost identical to his partner's. Same story, same lies, same comfortable delivery. When Keisha tried to question him about inconsistencies in their reports, Judge Brennan cut her off repeatedly. Ms. Williams, the judge said with obvious irritation, these officers have put their lives on the line to serve this community. I won't have you badgering them with irrelevant questions. When it was time for Keisha to present her defense, she called herself as a witness. Under oath, she told the truth about what had happened that night. She spoke calmly and clearly, describing exactly how the officers had escalated the situation without cause, but she could see that Judge Brennan wasn't listening. He was checking his watch, shuffling papers, and generally giving the impression that her testimony was a waste of his time. When she tried to explain that the dashcam footage would contradict the officer's testimony, Judge Brennan cut her off. Ms. Williams, we've already ruled on the admissibility of that footage. Move on. Your Honor, with respect, that footage is crucial to my defense. It shows that everything the officers testified to is false. Judge Brennan's face darkened. Young lady, I've been doing this for 12 years. I know when someone is trying to waste my time, these officers have no reason to lie about what happened. The phrase young lady hit Keisha like a slap. She was 34 years old, a federal prosecutor with 15 years of experience. But to Judge Brennan, she was just another young lady who didn't know her place. In her closing argument, Keisha laid out the evidence methodically, the inconsistencies in the officers' stories, the lack of any real reason for the traffic stop, the escalation of what should have been a simple interaction into an arrest for crimes that made no logical sense. But she could see it wasn't working. Judge Brennan was barely paying attention, and when he did look up, his expression was one of bored condescension. Chen's closing argument was brief. Your Honor, we have 2 experienced police officers who testified under oath about what they observed. The defendant wants us to believe that these officers, who have dedicated their lives to protecting our community, are lying. That's simply not credible. As Judge Brennan prepared to deliver his verdict, Keisha realized she was about to witness exactly the kind of injustice she had spent her career fighting against. The only difference was that this time, she was the victim. She reached into her briefcase and felt the weight of her federal credentials. The moment of truth was coming, and she had to decide, accept this injustice like thousands of others had been forced to do, or reveal who she really was and change everything. Judge Brennan adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of old wooden benches. Keisha could feel her heart pounding as she watched the judge's face, knowing what was coming. After hearing all the testimony, Judge Brennan began, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had been crushing people in this courtroom for 12 years. I find the evidence presented by the prosecution to be credible and convincing. Keisha felt a knot form in her stomach. She looked over at Officers Thompson and Rodriguez, who were sitting confidently in the front row. Thompson even had a slight smirk on his face. They had done this before, and they knew how it would end. The defendant, Judge Brennan continued, not even looking at Keisha, has failed to provide any credible evidence to contradict the testimony of 2 sworn police officers. Ms. Williams, your claims about the officers' conduct are simply not supported by the facts. The words stung because Keisha knew she had the facts. She had the dashcam footage that would prove everything. But Judge Brennan had refused to let the jury see it, claiming technical difficulties that didn't exist. Furthermore, the judge went on, his tone becoming more condescending, your behavior in this courtroom today shows a continued pattern of disrespect for authority. You've wasted this court's time with frivolous objections and baseless accusations against these fine officers. Keisha could see the prosecutor, David Chen, trying not to smile. He probably thought this was just another easy win, another case where the system worked exactly as it was designed to work, in favor of those with power and against those without it. Therefore, Judge Brennan said, raising his voice slightly, I find you guilty on both charges, resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. The words hit Keisha like a physical blow. She had spent 15 years sending criminals to prison, and now she was being convicted of crimes she didn't commit by a system she had devoted her life to serving. Before I pronounce sentence, Judge Brennan continued, clearly enjoying his moment of power, I want to say something to you, young lady. You came into my courtroom thinking you could outsmart the system. You thought you could make these officers look bad with your questions and your attitude. But the truth is, you have no one to blame but yourself for what happened that night. The gallery was completely quiet. Even the court reporter seemed to pause her typing. Judge Brennan leaned forward, his voice taking on a lecturing tone that Keisha had heard too many times directed at defendants who looked like her. If you had simply cooperated with the officers, if you had shown proper respect for their authority, none of this would have happened. Instead, you chose to be difficult. You chose to challenge them. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices. Keisha felt something burning inside her chest. It wasn't just anger. It was a deep, righteous fury at the complete perversion of justice she was witnessing. This man was blaming her for being the victim of police misconduct. He was turning her arrest for non-existent crimes into a lesson about knowing her place. I hereby sentence you to 60 days in the county jail, Judge Brennan announced. However, I'm willing to suspend that sentence if you agree to 1 year of probation, 100 hours of community service, and a fine of $1,500. Keisha heard someone in the gallery gasp. $1,500 was more than many people made in a month. The community service would take months to complete. And the probation meant that any minor infraction could send her to jail for the full 60 days. You have a choice, Ms. Williams, Judge Brennan said, his voice dripping with false generosity. Accept my offer, or spend the next 2 months behind bars. What's it going to be? This was the moment. This was the crossroads where so many innocent people had been forced to choose between accepting injustice and risking everything to fight it. Keisha understood now why so many defendants took plea bargains even when they were innocent. The system was rigged to make fighting back almost impossible. She stood up slowly, her mind racing. She could accept the sentence. She could pay the fine, do the community service, and put this whole nightmare behind her. No one would ever know that a federal prosecutor had been railroaded by a corrupt judge and lying police officers. But then she thought about Carlos, the young man who had pleaded guilty earlier that morning to something he probably didn't do. She thought about all the other defendants she had watched get crushed by this system. She thought about her daughter and what kind of world she wanted to leave for her. Your Honor, Keisha said, her voice steady and clear. "Before you finalize this sentence, I would like to present one additional piece of evidence." Judge Brennan looked annoyed. "Ms. Williams, the evidence portion of this trial is over. I've already rendered my verdict." "I understand that, Your Honor. But I believe this evidence is crucial to the court's understanding of this case." "What kind of evidence?" Chen asked, looking confused. Keisha reached into her briefcase. Her fingers touched the leather folder that contained her federal credentials. For weeks she had carried them with her, waiting for this moment. Now it was here. "I'd like to present my professional credentials," she said calmly. Judge Brennan waved his hand dismissively. "Your work credentials are irrelevant to this case. The fact that you work in law doesn't change what happened that night." "Actually, Your Honor, I think it does." Something in Keisha's tone made the courtroom atmosphere shift. People in the gallery leaned forward. Chen looked puzzled. Even the court reporter glanced up from her machine. Keisha opened the leather folder and pulled out her identification card. She held it up where everyone could see it. "Your Honor, I am Assistant United States Attorney Keisha Williams, currently assigned to the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for this district." The courtroom erupted. Someone in the gallery gasped loudly. Chen's mouth fell open. The court reporter's hands froze over her keyboard, but it was the look on Judge Brennan's face that Keisha would remember forever. The color drained from his cheeks as if someone had opened a valve. His confident smirk disappeared, replaced by something that looked like panic. "I have been observing these proceedings with great interest," Keisha continued, her voice carrying the authority that had been stripped from her for the past hour, particularly the court's handling of evidence, the treatment of defendants, and the credibility given to testimony that contradicts physical evidence. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez looked like they wanted to disappear through the floor. Thompson's confident smirk was gone, replaced by the expression of a man who had just realized he was in serious trouble. "Furthermore," Keisha said, holding up a thick folder, "I have spent the past several weeks documenting patterns of discriminatory sentencing in this courtroom. Cases where identical charges resulted in vastly different outcomes based on the race and economic status of the defendants." Judge Brennan tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Ms. Williams, this is highly irregular." "What's irregular, Your Honor, is a judge who refuses to admit evidence that would exonerate a defendant. What's irregular is sentencing someone for crimes that never happened based on testimony that contradicts video evidence." The power dynamic in the courtroom had completely shifted. Minutes ago, Keisha had been just another defendant being lectured about knowing her place. Now she was a federal prosecutor with the authority to investigate civil rights violations and the power to bring federal charges. "Your Honor," she continued, "I want to make it clear that everything I've witnessed here today will be included in my report to the Department of Justice. The pattern of bias, the suppression of evidence, and the apparent coordination between this court and local law enforcement to deny due process to defendants." Judge Brennan's hands were visibly shaking now. "Ms. Williams, surely we can discuss this in chambers." "There's nothing to discuss, Your Honor. I've seen everything I need to see." She turned to Officers Thompson and Rodriguez, who were both staring at her with expressions of pure terror. "Officers, you should know that lying under oath in federal court is a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Conspiracy to deprive someone of their civil rights under color of law carries a penalty of up to 10 years. I'll be referring your case to my colleagues in the criminal division." The courtroom was dead silent except for the sound of Rodriguez whispering what sounded like a prayer under his breath. Keisha packed her credentials back into her briefcase and looked around the courtroom one last time. Tomorrow, everything would be different. But today she had gotten exactly what she came for. A front-row seat to the corruption that had been destroying lives in this courtroom for years, and now she had all the evidence she needed to tear it down. The days following Keisha's revelation in the courtroom moved like dominoes falling in slow motion. Within hours of her leaving Judge Brennan's courtroom, word had spread throughout the legal community like wildfire. By evening, the story was making headlines in local newspapers and legal blogs. Keisha returned to her federal office the next morning to find her phone ringing nonstop. Reporters wanted interviews. Civil rights attorneys wanted to share their own stories about Judge Brennan's courtroom. Most importantly, defendants who had been railroaded by the same system were reaching out, many for the first time finding the courage to speak up. Her supervisor, U.S. Attorney Patricia Reynolds, called an emergency meeting. "Keisha, I need to understand exactly what happened here. You put yourself through the system without telling anyone?" Keisha sat across from her boss, someone she had worked with for 8 years and respected deeply. "I had to see it for myself, Patricia. If I had walked into that courtroom as a federal prosecutor, everyone would have been on their best behavior. I needed to experience what ordinary citizens go through every day." "And what did you find?" Keisha opened the thick file she had been building for weeks. Systematic civil rights violations, pattern evidence of racial bias in sentencing, suppression of evidence, and police perjury that goes back years. Patricia flipped through the documents, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This is extensive. How long has this been going on?" "Based on my research, at least 5 years, probably longer." Within a week, the Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into the municipal court system. Keisha was assigned to lead the federal civil rights investigation, giving her the resources and authority to dig deeper than she ever could have alone. The first breakthrough came when other officers started talking. Detective Lisa Park, who had worked with Thompson and Rodriguez, came forward with information about what she called the game. Officers would make questionable arrests knowing that Judge Brennan would convict regardless of the evidence. It was an understanding that had developed over years, never spoken aloud but clearly understood by everyone involved. They called it phishing, Detective Park told Keisha during her interview. Pull over someone in the wrong neighborhood, find any excuse to arrest them and let Judge Brennan sort it out. They knew he'd always side with the officers. The dashcam footage that Judge Brennan had refused to admit became central evidence in the federal investigation. When Keisha finally played it for a grand jury, the contrast between what actually happened and what the officers testified to was so stark that several jurors gasped out loud. Officer Thompson cracked first. Faced with federal perjury charges and a potential 10-year sentence, he agreed to cooperate with the investigation. His confession opened the floodgates. It started small, he told federal investigators. Judge Brennan would make comments about certain defendants, you know. He'd say things like, "These people need to learn respect for authority." After a while, we understood what he wanted to hear. Thompson's confession led to Rodriguez, who provided even more details about their arrangement with Judge Brennan. It wasn't formal corruption, no money changed hands. It was something more insidious, a shared understanding that certain people deserved to be convicted regardless of their guilt or innocence. Meanwhile, Keisha's office was flooded with calls from people who had been through Judge Brennan's courtroom over the years. Maria Santos, a single mother who had been sentenced to jail time for a traffic violation she could prove she didn't commit. Robert Kim, a college student who had been convicted of disorderly conduct for asking questions during his arrest. Dozens of cases where justice had been perverted by bias and prejudice. Judge Brennan himself became increasingly desperate as the investigation closed in around him. He hired one of the city's most expensive defense attorneys and tried to claim that he had been misunderstood, that his tough sentencing was simply about maintaining order in his courtroom. But the evidence was overwhelming. Keisha had documented everything: the statistical disparities in sentencing, the pattern of excluding evidence that favored minority defendants, the coordinated perjury between officers and the court. The breaking point came when Keisha discovered that Judge Brennan had been in communication with the police department about specific cases. Email records showed him asking for background information on defendants before their trials, information that was never shared with defense attorneys and that influenced his decisions. 3 months after that day in the courtroom, the dominoes finally finished falling. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez were arrested on federal charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights and perjury. They were both convicted and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Their police careers were over, their pensions forfeited, and their names forever associated with corruption. Judge Brennan was removed from the bench by the State Judicial Conduct Board. The evidence against him was so extensive that he didn't even fight the removal. He quietly resigned and moved to another state, his legal career in ruins. But the real victory came in the changes to the system itself. The municipal court implemented new procedures requiring all evidence to be reviewed by independent magistrates before trials. Dashboard camera footage became mandatory evidence in all traffic-related cases. Most importantly, a new oversight committee was established to monitor sentencing patterns and investigate complaints of bias. Keisha found herself testifying before Congress about the need for federal oversight of local courts. Her experience became a case study taught in law schools across the country. But the moment that meant the most to her came 6 months later, when she received a letter from Carlos, the young man she had watched plead guilty in Judge Brennan's courtroom. Ms. Williams, the letter read, "I saw the news about what happened with Judge Brennan and those officers. I wanted you to know that because of your investigation, I was able to get my conviction overturned. The public defender said it was because you proved there was a pattern of bias in those cases. I'm in college now studying criminal justice. Maybe someday I can help people the way you helped me." The letter made Keisha cry, not from sadness, but from a deep sense of satisfaction that justice had finally been served. At home, her daughter asked her about all the attention she had been getting. "Mom, are you famous now?" Keisha laughed. "I'm not famous, sweetheart. I just did my job. But everyone's talking about how brave you were." Keisha thought about that for a moment. You know what real bravery is? It's all the people who went through that courtroom before me and tried to fight back even though they knew they might lose. People who didn't have the advantages I have but still stood up for what was right. The case changed Keisha's career trajectory. She was promoted to head the Civil Rights Division and became a national expert on judicial bias and police misconduct. But more importantly, it changed how she saw her role as a prosecutor. She established a new unit dedicated to investigating complaints about local courts and police departments. She created a hotline for people to report civil rights violations, and she made sure that her office would never again ignore the voices of ordinary citizens who claimed they had been treated unfairly by the system. Years later, when law students asked her about the case, Keisha always emphasized one point. The system only works when people in power are willing to experience it the way everyone else does. If you want to fix something, you have to understand what it feels like to be broken by it. The municipal courthouse where Judge Brennan once ruled still stands, but it's a different place now. Fair trials happen there. Evidence is heard. Justice is served without regard to race or economic status. And sometimes, late at night when she drives past that courthouse on her way home from work, Keisha remembers that traffic stop that changed everything. She thinks about how one moment of injustice, when met with courage and determination, can transform an entire system. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. Sometimes it's about making sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else again.